Jesus, why don't the Gospels talk about the early years of Jesus? I'm glad you mentioned this, because in addition to saying that Jesus must have been married, people like to say, well, Jesus, what happened from the time he was 12 until he was 30? And of course, there are television shows like this, and, there are all kinds of speculation. He went to India, he went to Egypt, he went to Persia. My godfather insisted he went to Greece. My godfather insisted that he studied Greek philosophy in Athens. I could not convince him. It was important to him to say that Jesus went to Athens and studied Greek philosophy. He said, I can prove it. I said, how? He said, because when St. Paul said, he went to Athens, he said, I see you have a temple to an unknown God. And that's how he said, you see, Jesus was there and they built a temple to him. Can't argue with that. So, early years of Jesus. Why don't the Gospels tell us about the early years of Jesus? Very simple. Nothing happened. I'm telling you the truth. Nothing interesting happened. From the birth, the only thing that was significant was that one episode when he was 12 years old, went to the temple and basically ditched his family and went back to they find him in the temple when he's 12. So think about this. The Gospels are not a biography. They don't tell us everything about the life of Christ. It's about the public ministry, death, and resurrection of Christ. So nothing interesting happened. What was Jesus doing? He was growing up. That's what he was doing. He learned a trade, certainly. Even Mark calls him a carpenter. And that was Joseph's trade. So Jesus learned the trade. He supported his mother. He studied the scriptures. And he waited until he was old enough to be taken seriously as an adult teacher, as a rabbi. So in the meantime, he just lived his life. What are the Gospels going to say? Mary sent Jesus outside to feed the chickens in the yard. Jesus went and got some water from the well. I mean, what are they going to talk about? There was nothing to say. Now, the other reason is we know that he never left, and we know that nothing extraordinary happened. There are apocrypha that describe the childhood of Jesus, in which he's going around doing little miracles here and there. And of course, none of that happened. So how do we know this? Because when Jesus begins to preach in Nazareth, in a beautiful scene, he gets up and starts preaching. His first time in the synagogue of Nazareth preaching, people are astonished. They're amazed. And they said, but he has no education. So he has no rabbinic education. Isn't this Joseph's kid? Or isn't this the good kid we know? Isn't that the town carpenter? Yeah, that's him. So people are astonished, and nobody says, he must have learned this while he was gone. Remember those years when Jesus was gone? Maybe he went to India, studied under the gurus. But it's just ridiculous. But History Channel, Discovery Channel, PBS, all this, I'm controlling myself not to say a bad word. Nonsense. Why do they insist on it? Follow the money. That's how they get you to watch these programs. The hidden years of Jesus. He must have gone here. They actually get professors to talk about this nonsense. Okay, how do we know? Think about it, just common sense. What was Jesus going to study there? Honest to God, what is he going to study? Hinduism? Really? Greek philosophy? He's going to go there, he's going to go to Egypt, he's going to go study that? Why? He's a Jew. He's going to go to the place of idolatry to study what? And show me one thing in Jesus' teachings which show influence from Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Egyptian religion, Greek philosophy. There's nothing. So all of this speculation is built on nothing. Nothing. Okay? So that's my answer. Why isn't it not the Gospels? Because he didn't do anything interesting. So he was waiting to reveal himself to the world as an adult, as a rabbi. So that's number one. Number two, how do we know that there were 500 apostles? Because in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul lists some of the resurrection appearances of Jesus, and he says he appeared to Cephas, then to James, to the 12, to 500 people all at once, some of whom are living, but some of whom have fallen asleep, but most of whom are still alive. He appeared to the apostles, he appeared to the 12, he separates the 12 from the apostles, and he mentions the 500. So this is how we know. This is the earliest written account of the resurrection appearances of Christ. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that Jesus was seen by all these people, alive again, not just by the 12. So this is how we know that. And we know that the term apostle was used in other ways, because the apostles are listed as separate from the 12 and different from the 500. We also know that there is a woman named apostle, and that's Junia. She's in Romans 16, and she's called apostle. So the term, today we will say about people like Mary Magdalene, is apostolos, equal to the apostles. We say that for Constantinou and Helen. That's a kind of a term of respect. But in the early church, female followers of Jesus, who were eyewitnesses, like Mary Magdalene, like Mary and Martha, like Joanna and Susanna, and others who are mentioned, they were called apostle also. And there are relatives of St. Paul who were followers of Jesus, a couple called Andronicus and Junia, and Paul calls them apostles, and they're a married couple and saints of the church. Okay, so a little bit long answer to a question, but here we go. Here we're talking about manuscripts and translations. The manuscripts. So where does your Bible come from? That's a really good question, because we don't really think about these things. Every ancient book exists somewhere in the world as a manuscript. When we say manuscript in biblical studies, we do not mean your unpublished great, novel. That's my manuscript. No, manuscript. Today we refer to manuscript as an unpublished book. But in the ancient world and in biblical studies, manuscript means handwritten book. Manu, that's Latin, scriptus, writing. Okay? So handwritten book, a copy of the book. Every ancient book that we have today exists somewhere in the world as a manuscript copy, whether it's Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Augustine, the Sermons of St. John Chrysostom. They exist today in the printed books that you're buying at your bookstore downstairs because somebody copied them by hand, and that handmade copy, that manuscript, exists somewhere. We don't have the originals. We're going to talk about this, okay? So, there are about 10,000 Bible manuscripts in the world. Now, think of what did I tell you? Is the Bible one volume? No. So these 10,000 copies are not the whole Bible. They are individual books, or sometimes collections, like all the epistles of Paul, or the 4 Gospels, or Luke, Acts, or there's about 10,000 different pieces of Bible manuscripts in different places of the world. Okay, that's a lot. There are about 100,000 total ancient copies of ancient books, manuscripts in the world, 100,000. 10,000 doesn't seem like a lot, but it's the vast majority. If you think of all the ancient authors and all their ancient works, take just Chrysostom, who is the most prolific Greek author, who's got dozens and volumes of Chrysostom. There's volumes of Chrysostom. So all of those, all the ancient writings in Latin and in Greek and everything, and all of the ancient pre-Christian writers and philosophers and everything, 100,000, 10% of that is the Bible. That's a huge percentage. The next largest, I'm not sure if I have, what I'm going to say over there. The next largest number, one of the largest number of copies of any ancient work. You want to guess what it is? Well, we're talking about pre-Christian. Quran is after Christianity. The largest number of copies is the Iliad. It exists in 80 copies. It was very important in Greek history, Greek mythology. The Iliad exists in 80 copies, 80 manuscript copies, as compared to 10,000 copies of Bible books. that shows you how important the Bible is. So where are these various copies? Well, they're in different kinds of collections. They are in university collections. Harvard has the Houghton Library. They actually have extremely ancient manuscripts. I don't know how they acquired them. University of Chicago, national libraries, Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, the British Museum, the Israeli Museum, the Museum of St. Petersburg in Russia, religious collections on Mount Athos. They have many priceless manuscripts. St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai, the Vatican Library. They're scattered all over, and in some cases they belong to individual private collectors, but most of them are in institutions. I was looking at this Bibliothèque Nationale. This past summer, I went to Cyprus, as I was telling you. I was trying to figure out how and when the Church of Cyprus accepted the book of Revelation as scripture. Because this is a real puzzle to me. I have some ideas about how this happened, but it would be nice to have some proof. So I went to the Church of Cyprus, and I was asking some questions, and I asked this monk at this monastery of St. Neophytos, who just heard about the book of Revelation. And he says, oh, you're not going to find this in Cyprus. You have to go to Paris. I'm like, Paris? Well, a lot of these things were stolen. They were stolen. And even the British Museum has, we're going to see, the most famous Bible manuscript, and they basically took it, but they said we're going to borrow it, and they never returned it. So, in a way, probably they did us a favor, because I'm not so sure how well the Greeks would have taken care of it way back then. Or the monks, they didn't really realize these treasures that they had. But Bibliothèque Nationale has the ancient copies, the most ancient copies of Bible manuscripts that used to be on Cyprus. And I said, but why would they said they were sold to them. I said, but why would the Church of Cyprus sell it? Because the Latins wanted them, and the church, remember that Cyprus was under occupation, and the Latins were in good graces with the Turks, and they basically threatened the Patriarch of Constantinople that they were going to kill him so the Patriarch suggested strongly that they sell the manuscripts to the Latins, and they were pressured to do so by the Turks. So, we don't think about this, but this is the reality. For the Greeks, I was trying to find copies of the New Testament, but there are no copies of the New Testament printed in Greece. Why? There are no publishing houses in Greece during the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. They're under Turkish occupation. So sometimes we forget this. That was the reality that our ancestors, our physical ancestors or our ancestors of the faith, lived with. Sometimes we say, how come the Orthodox don't know their faith? And why don't they? You know what? They were just trying to stay alive until recently. And we don't think about that. But the fact that Russia is now free, and think of the millions of martyrs in Russia. And then Greece only became a modern country after World War I. So prior to that, 400 years of Turkish rule. So sometimes we are harsh in our judgments for Orthodox in other parts of the world, but they didn't have what we have. The ability to learn and study and have books and things like this. So I'm sorry, that reminded me of this. They said you have to go to Paris because that's where they are. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. But I know the librarian, she's very helpful. I don't think I'm going to go to Paris. And it would be heartbreaking, to tell you the truth. How does the Bible stack up against other ancient writings in the number of copies? I told you this already. Biblical books exist in far more copies than any other ancient writing. Second place is Homer's Iliad. Okay, only 90 copies, but this is a lot. But there's no comparison to the Bible. So you have sometimes there are manuscripts where there's a famous work like by Aristotle that exists in one copy. There is a belief that what we have today is only about 10% of the books that existed in antiquity. So if you think about all of the ancient writings, and we know that there are books that people wrote, like St. Justin, the martyr philosopher, and they don't exist today. Okay, we just have a tiny fraction of the books that existed. Well, why? Well, guess what happened? During the year 609, 610, the Persians came, they invaded the Eastern Roman Empire, and they destroyed, bless you, virtually every city. So there were cities like Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea Philippi, where Eusebius had written his church history, where Origen had an incredible work called the Exapla. I can't even begin to describe it to you, which was so massive it was never copied, and those things were burnt. So a lot of things, the Library of Alexandria was destroyed. So a lot of things were lost that, we just don't have copies of. So, it doesn't take much. So most of the writings of antiquity we do not have. So we have 700 copies of the Gospel, one copy of this one work of Aristotle. I wish I knew which one it was, I don't remember. What are they made of? Papyrus, parchment, and vellum. So let's take a look at this. The papyrus plant, this is what it looks like. It's kind of a pretty plant. I was thinking, that would look nice in my front yard. I wonder if it would grow. Probably not. It's sort of a river reed. The stalks are stringy like celery, but they would flatten them, they would open them up, they would flatten them out and lay them side by side, and then overlap and create a sheet that kind of looked like this. So the good side, they had lines, and because it was like celery, which is sort of ribbed, or you could write on the horizontal side, that was the good side, and the other side they went up and down, so you're kind of writing kind of bumpy if you write on the other side. So that's what papyrus looked like. It was very inexpensive. It was sold and people could buy it. We have a lot of papyrus fragments of things like receipts or contracts for the sale of a cow. Believe it or not, some papyrus fragments remain that are not having anything to do with the Bible. It's rare that they're found because papyrus is very fragile. This is the writing that supposedly had a statement about Jesus' wife. Remember that a couple of years ago? There was a big to-do. There's this papyrus fragment where Jesus, it says, my wife. Do you remember that? That was so ridiculous. And that fragment was, I want to show you how big it was. Okay. It was this big. Supposedly it said, my wife, Jesus said, my wife, and it was this big. Okay, so there's no way that this is going to survive as a fragment and not be known. I mean, there are fragments like this size, actually of actual biblical books, but they're all cataloged. And they're all in like these collections, and people they know what already is out there. So all of a sudden somebody said, I have this fragment that talks about Jesus' wife. Wow, look at that. Of course, the feminists are all watching. Well, look at that, Jesus is a wife, or we have to have female priests. Well, first of all, I mean, I'll have to tell you, Bible scholars were absolutely almost 100% skeptical. Almost 100%. The woman who was saying that this was genuine was a professor at Harvard, and the person who was supposedly verifying it was one of my classmates at Harvard from years before. And I thought to myself, I said, I have got to go to this conference, the Society of Biblical Literature, and see how she's going to defend this. Well, she didn't show up because everybody was trashing the fact that this was genuine, and it was quickly disproven. But in the meantime, the media had latched onto this. It was in the newspapers, and the magazines, and the television, that Jesus has a wife. And it's just so much nonsense. I can't begin to tell you. But we do have papyrus fragments that are this big of books of the Bible. We can identify which book it came from. But they're known because they're all cataloged. All these things are cataloged for many years. Papyrus is an inexpensive writing material. It becomes very brittle. So it's not like somebody was carrying this around in their wallet and survived for all those years. It becomes brittle. because it's a plant. And now, after a while, the church stopped using papyrus for their scriptures. The earliest Bible manuscripts were on papyrus because it was inexpensive. But think of the time it would take to copy even a short gospel like Mark onto papyrus. You'd want it to be on something more durable so it wouldn't fall apart, because papyrus would become brittle, very fragile. Some of us have old books that are maybe 100 years old, and you know how the pages get very brittle? Well, papyrus is even more brittle than that. So you put a lot of time into copying a book, you want it to be lasting. So they began to copy the Bible onto parchment. That's an animal skin. Parchment is not fancy paper. Today, when we say parchment, maybe you say, well, I'm going to print up my resume on parchment. It's a fancy paper. But that's not what parchment is. Parchment is animal skins. This is what they would do to it. They would stretch out the skin of the animal, they would skin it, they would remove the hair from the outside, they would stretch it, they would bleach it, they would dry it, and it became a very nice surface on which to write. Very smooth, very white, kind of off-white, a little bit thick, like a cardstock kind of thickness, not as thin as our paper, but very nice and very durable. So most of our Bible manuscripts are on parchment because it survives longer than papyrus, which was quite brittle. So most of the copies of the Bible are from the 4th century onward. Why? What do you think? Monasteries? Legalization of Christianity. Yeah, because prior to that, definitely monasteries helped with copies and things like this, but it's primarily because the Romans tried to gather. The first thing that they did in the Great Persecution, the last really big persecution, is gather all the scriptures that the Christians liked to read and destroyed them. So we don't have too many before the year 300. We do have a lot, but not like we have for afterwards. Some books and fragments are older. This one, here's an example of a fragment, which is about the size of this card. That's a gospel from the Gospel of Matthew, and it dates to the year 100. Okay? So, how old are they? The oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, are first century BC, first century AD, and those are the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we're lucky to have them, because if the Jews had known about them, they wouldn't exist. Here's why. So let's talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are the hills by the shores of the Dead Sea, and there was a community that lived there, which is just remarkable. Very strict Jews who tried to observe the law of Moses, and they were educated. They had lots of biblical books, and this was the most important biblical find ever, because that was the oldest copies of the Bible in Hebrew, of the Old Testament Hebrew that we had. And so there were about 1,000. Here's the Dead Sea down here. Sea of Galilee up here. Dead Sea is down here. Discovered by accident in these caves, because the people who copied them wanted to preserve them, and so they kept them in the caves. Some people thought that they always kept them in the caves, kind of like a library annex. Other people think that they hid them there because a war broke out with the Romans, and nobody knew that the caves were there until they were discovered accidentally in 1948. Okay? And they were hidden in these pots because they were scrolls. So they would wrap them up and then stand them up like wrapping paper. They would stand them up inside these tall bits of pottery. So here's one of them, probably the Isaiah scroll. They're still studying them because a lot of them just sort of fell to pieces over time as they were standing in those pots. And they're very important because they're the oldest copies. Prior to that, we only had the Masoretic text from about 1,000 years before, 1,000 years later. So these are the oldest copies of biblical books in existence, of the Hebrew Bible, I should say. And that was very, very important, because now we could compare the Hebrew of the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Masoretic text. Of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls do not have the dots and dashes that the Masoretes added around the year 1000. But the Hebrew matched up very well. But guess what? Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls matched the Septuagint. Some people said, oh, the Septuagint, you shouldn't pay any attention to it because it doesn't comport with the Hebrew. But some of the scrolls confirmed the Septuagint. Okay? So that's why they were very important. They were the oldest copies because Christians kept their old book. But Jews bury Torah scrolls. That's why old scrolls. That's why we're lucky the Jews did not know about them. Because they wouldn't exist today. Now, of course, they're not going to destroy them. But if a scroll, any scripture scroll, becomes too fragile to use or too faint to read, the Jews have a funeral, an actual funeral service, and they bury it. Okay? So they don't have old copies. The Christians never did that. Christians just would make a new copy before the old one got too hard to read, and they would keep the old copy as well. But the Jews would destroy old copies of scrolls. That's why we have a lot more Christian copies. And that's why even old Masoretic texts are in the hands of Christians. Because it happened to be, like some of the old Masoretic Bibles, original ones, are in the St. Petersburg Library. They're in the custody of Christians. If the Jews had had them, they would have been destroyed a long time ago. So now we can compare the Dead Sea Scrolls with the medieval copies of the Hebrew book. That's really important. So, most of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're all scrolls because the Jews wrote on scrolls. But most of our New Testament books are codices. And a codex is a manuscript in book form. And this is what the Christians, one of the great things that Christians contributed, they got rid of scrolls and they created the book. Okay? So Christians preferred this. And why? It's so efficient, right? A Torah scroll will be wider than this room. Okay? Now imagine Genesis is over there and Deuteronomy is over here, and it's open to Genesis, but your reading is from Deuteronomy, and it's all rolled up. You have to turn it. Whereas if you have a codex, you just do this. You turn the whole section and you're in Deuteronomy. So it's much more efficient. And Christians were the ones who started copying the books onto what we call a book form, a codex. We have no autographs of any biblical book. An autograph is what we call the original in biblical studies. It's not Angelina Jolie's handwriting. His autograph is the original. We don't have any originals. We don't have Paul's originals, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. We don't have any originals. Even if we did, we wouldn't know it's the original. Because we don't know what their handwriting looked like. And even Paul used scribes to write things for him. At the end of Romans, Tertius says, I, Tertius, who wrote this letter, send you my greetings. He was the scribe, so we wouldn't know what Paul's handwriting looked like, anyhow. We have no autographs. That means that what we have are copies. And they're copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. So what happens is when you make a handmade copy, little variations creep in. Either because a word sounds similar, or because it looks similar, or because the scribe is kind of sloppy. You have sloppy scribes. You know, you guys all know who you were as students. Either you were that student that just hurried up and finished the assignment, you would not have been a good scribe. But we have scribes like that. We're kind of sloppy and they're in a hurry and they make a lot of mistakes. And people who study these manuscripts know, and they can tell who was a good scribe and who was a careless scribe. So they actually consider that when they're deciding whether or not to trust a manuscript. So you have that, or maybe you're one of those students who was like very exacting, really want to get the A, then those are better manuscripts, okay? So we have people, these are human beings, okay? So we have no autographs, we have a lot of copies, and every single copy is unique. Why? Because it's handmade. So no two copies of any biblical book are exactly alike. So, there's a famous Bible scholar, his name is Bart Ehrman, who was raised in a kind of fundamentalist background. The Bible is perfect, and all this, and guess what? He found out that copies don't agree. And he was totally scandalized, and now he's either an atheist or an agnostic, I'm not sure. Why? Because he was shocked to find out that the Bible, copies of the Bible are not perfect. I mean, the Bible is perfect, but the people who copy it, they're not perfect. Of course they're not perfect. This is the reality. We're not used to this, but in the ancient world, everybody knew that copies were not perfect. They talk, St. Gregory of Nyssa talks about it. Origen talks about it. Chrysostom talks about it. Chrysostom is preaching on the Gospel of John. He says, he reads a line, he says, better copies use this word. John the Baptist was preaching on Bethany on the other side of the Jordan, in Bethany on the other side of the Jordan. St. John Chrysostom says, this is not a good copy. The more accurate copy, St. John was preaching in Bethbara on the other side of the Jordan. He thinks that that's a mistake. Does he get all worried about it? It's just a mistake. Actually, it's not a mistake. It's correct to say Bethany, but he thought it had a mistake. Did it scandalize him? No, they were used to it because that's what books were. That's why the book of Revelation has a curse at the end for anybody who changes it. That wasn't unique to Revelation. That was a real problem for authors, that people would change their writings. That's why every manuscript is unique, because they're all handmade. So the most famous manuscript in the world is the Codex Sinaiticus. It was discovered on Mount Sinai. It's the oldest complete copy of the Bible. It goes back to the 4th century, and it's got our 27 books plus a couple more, because the canon had not been decided. Okay? Codex Sinaiticus. That means now you know it's not a scroll, it's a codex, that's what it looks like. Pretty nice copy, too. And it was discovered on Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's Monastery, by a British guy who took it to St. Petersburg to kind of borrow it, and it sort of sold to the, they're in Russia, and then it ends up in the British Museum. So there's St. Catherine's Monastery. And now it's here, the British Museum in London, where it's in a beautiful case, and they turn the page every day, one page, and you can look at it, but I'm sure almost nobody does. Instead, they look at, lyrics by John Lennon, and probably Harry Potter, and Shakespeare original. I mean, those are getting a lot more attention. They're in the British Museum than the Codex Sinaiticus, which is very famous among Bible scholars. So, the Bible is not one book, remember that. It's a library of books. So, some books were grouped together, and they start to group Gospels together. 4 Gospels, epistles of Paul, things like this. So why wasn't the Bible one volume? It's just impossible to do it. And one of the things that is really admired about the Codex Sinaiticus is that they were able to put so many pages together, because it was very difficult to do. It's considered a masterpiece of ancient bookbinding. Here's what a manuscript looks like. They would write in these columns, you see? And notice that, what do you notice about the writing? It's all uppercase, we call that an uncial. There's no spaces between the words, and there's no punctuation. This is 4th century. This is what the Bible looked like when Chrysostom would come out and read and expound on the scriptures for the day. This is what the reader would read from in church. And it's hard for us to imagine that somebody had to dream up spaces, but they did. There were no spaces, ancient writing, maybe because the materials were harder to come by. Today we have paper, and we throw away copies that aren't quite straight, and they were very careful with their resources. So here's another view of the Codex Sinaiticus. You see how neat it is? And all the writing in columns. And this gives you an idea of the size. So it would be hard. And if it's on parchment, which it is, and the paper's kind of thick, there's no way you're going to fit. This is the New Testament. You're not going to fit the whole Bible in one volume. So let's talk about manuscript variations, so I'm trying to explain to you that as people copied a book, invariably little mistakes crept in. Some of them were intentional, and some of them are not. Here's a manuscript variation. Remember when the disciples try to cast out the boy that has a demon, and the old man whose son is possessed, or he's an epileptic, it's called the epileptic demoniac, and the father comes to Jesus and says, please help my son if you can. I asked your disciples and they tried, but they weren't able to. And Jesus says, what do you mean if you can? All things are possible to him who believes. And the father says, I believe, help my unbelief. Remember that story? So afterwards, the disciples say to Jesus, why couldn't we cast it out? And Jesus says, this kind can only be taken out by prayer. But some manuscripts say, this kind can only be taken out by prayer and fasting. So, the fasting, is this a variation? Did somebody not notice this and just left it like this? Was it an omission or was it an addition? So this is the question, okay? So, most manuscript variations are minor and they don't affect the meaning of what is written. So here's an example. Before Jesus fed the multitudes, right, he has the 5 loaves and the fishes, and he says, give them something to eat. Well, we just have these 5 loaves and these 2 fish. And so it tells us in Mark's gospel, after they find out that they have this small amount of food, he commanded them all to sit down. Now, your copy, Gospel of Mark, some say he commanded them to be seated. Now you might say it's the same thing. Well, the copyists thought it was the same thing. But it's not the same because be seated is passive and sit down is active. Okay, so that's a different word. It would be a different word. Other manuscripts have he commanded them all to be seated. They have the word, again. So the first one left out the word all. The second one has it, but makes it passive. Other manuscripts said then he sat them down. That's a manuscript variation, and there's lots of little variants like that in the Bible. So, no, most of the time, this is what it is. It doesn't make any difference. It's not like we have copies of the Bible that say, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Other copies say, no, he's not. It's like this. They're piddly little things. You wouldn't think of them as important, and they're not. But nonetheless, that's what we call a variant. And that's the thing that disturbed Bart Ehrman so much, and he left the Christian faith. Okay? So, you have to understand, this is not what makes the Bible inspired, because a copyist copied it correctly. That's not what makes the Bible inspired. It's the content. So if there's little manuscript variations, that doesn't make any difference for our faith. Some variations occur because the scribe is harmonizing. Here's a really good example. Remember we call it the Gadarene demoniac. We hear this a couple times a year in church. So Mark writes that Jesus was in the country of the Gerasenes. And Matthew has the Gadarenes. Okay, so sometimes scribes don't like that. A good scribe will copy exactly what the previous copy he's copying from has. But sometimes they say, well, this isn't right. Matthew has Gadarenes, Mark has Gergesenes, and he says the previous copies, remember, they know that they're copying a copy. So the scribe here who's making the new copy, he says, the guy I'm copying from, he made a mistake. I'm going to fix this. So sometimes they make changes, variants, because they think they're fixing the mistakes of the previous scribe. And we see that a lot in the book of Revelation, because the book of Revelation has very strange Greek. It's what we call Semitic Greek. It's somebody who doesn't have Greek as their native language. He's a very Jewish kind of style of Greek. So there's a lot of variations, because they said, oh, John couldn't have written this. There was a terrible scribe who copied this. I'm going to fix it. So there's a lot of variations like that. So what happens, you have, Mark has this originally, Matthew has Gerasenes, Matthew has Gadarenes, and some copies of Mark have Gadarenes, some copies of Matthew have Gerasenes. So scribes were picking one, it's got to be one or the other. Which one is it? They chose one, and they were consistent in both Gospels because they assumed it has to be one or the other. So that's what they did. Sometimes manuscript variations happen when the author skips a spot. when he's looking at the text, and then the copyist, he's writing down, he goes back, and he writes down, and sometimes that happens where your eye goes to another part of the text which has the same word where you left off. Okay, that happens. Some variations occur when there's a hole in the manuscript, or it's kind of smudged and you can't read it, or the end of the word, the edge of the manuscript has fallen off, and then there's a way that they know that that's the case, because in that spot they're guessing at what the word is, okay? And so then you see a lot of different variations of what the word is, and they say, oh, the original, there was a lacuna, they call them lacunas, a hole or a mistake or something, they couldn't read it. Some variations are just spelling errors because some words sound alike in Greek, but they're spelled differently, just like we have in English, right? We have a lot of homonyms in English, words that sound like weather and weather, and so many different ones, a hole and hole, and lots of different things. So, it is easier for a camel, Camilo, to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And everybody says, why would you put a camel through the eye of a needle? Or you could say it is easier for a rope, Camilo, to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. It is the same sound in Greek, Camilo, camel, and Camilon, rope. It's the same sound in Greek. What's different is the I, iota, or the E, ypsilon here. So there was one priest in San Diego who used to make a big deal about this. No, it's got to be a rope. It's a rope. Passing that needle. So why? It makes no sense. Why would you try to put a camel, etc.? So people have come up with all kinds of explanations for this. Some people say, well, there was this gate that was really small, and they used to call it the eye of a needle, and the camel couldn't go through there. And I don't really know if that's true. I really should. People say this to me all the time. I really should investigate and see if that's true. Why is it, since this makes sense, that this was a manuscript variation instead of this, why do our copies, our Bibles today, continue to say camel? Because the oldest copies have camel. Newer copies, they try to fix it. So more recent copies, and much later, hundreds of years later, they said this can't be right. It's got to be rope. So some copies, they try to fix that. But all the early copies have camel. So that's why your Bible still has camel. Okay? Okay, so sometimes variants don't make any sense, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. Okay? Sometimes there's a reason why it's, I don't mean a variant. Sometimes the text, there's something weird about it, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. Maybe Jesus really said camel. And we just haven't figured out why yet. And then we might find something. There might be a Jewish proverb that somebody discovers next year when they talk about a camel going through an eye. You know what I'm trying to say? That's how we find out the meanings of things over time. When discoveries are made, then we, figure these things out. But we don't always know. So just because if it's really camel, that doesn't mean it's wrong. Very few variations are significant. Most variations are a word here and there, and they're nothing really important. So, who decided that your Bible will still say camel and not a thick rope? Textual critics. These are the people who are responsible for giving us the basic Greek we're talking about here, New Testament Greek. What are they? And textual criticism, what is that? These are people who are experts in manuscripts. They spend their whole lives studying the manuscripts, dating them, comparing them. After they've compared them, they come up with a decision. They look at all the variations. So let me give you an example. The book of Revelation exists in about 300 Greek manuscripts, 300 copies of the Greek manuscripts. A textual critic will compare all of the different variations. Every chapter has some little words that are different here and there. And then they will arrive at what they think, how the original was. What did John originally write? And they call that a critical text. There's a lot of ways that they analyze it. Sometimes they look at the oldest manuscript. Sometimes they consider how accurate the scribe was in that manuscript. Sometimes they can figure out why a variation occurs. They take that into consideration. They look at the style of the author. What would John have used there? Does John prefer the passive tense, or does John prefer the active tense? Does John use the indicative like this or like that? So they look at that, and then they make a decision based on the best evidence, and we have to use what they say, or we have to have an opinion about it, because we don't have the autograph, we don't have the original. So we have to come up with a decision, and we call that the critical text. Okay? And they also look at the age, like we talked about. They look at the style of writing, they can figure all of this out. So let's take a look at some of these texts. And from the critical text, then we do translation. We start with the critical text, then we do translation. So, for a long time, all alphabets were uncials. Hebrew is still an unsealed alphabet. There's no lowercase Hebrew letters. So here's a Greek unsealed. And we kind of pointed this out. This is the beginning of the Gospel of John. There's no spaces. En, he, in, o, logos. Que o logos in pros ton theon. Theon, God. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. Theon is abbreviated there. But there's no spaces, right? Okay, this is how it would look if you were reading it in Greek. The other thing you've noticed about this, now it's okay if you already know it, but if you've never seen it before, I sometimes have my students try to read this. And if you've never heard it before, you're trying to figure out where one word ends and another one begins. And they use a kind of what we call today wrap around. And the word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and everything by him was made. When they got to, they didn't separate the words with the hyphen the way we're taught, according to the syllable, none of that. Okay, so that's what your Bible looked like. That's what in the 4th century. That's some spaces. It makes a lot of sense, right? But it's still uppercase. So uppercase, no spaces, no punctuation. All right? This is the same book, but now we have spaces. Okay, so this is an unsealed maybe from the 500s. They start to add spaces. So this is how a textual critic can date a manuscript by the style of writing. Now spaces, still uppercase only, unsealed, but there's a space. En, achim, in, o, logos, get, o, logos, in, pros, ton, theon. Okay, that's how we get to. So those are majuscules. Later they developed for Greek lowercase letters. And spaces and handwriting and pretty writing like this. This is Byzantine. That's called a minuscule, means upper and lower case. Okay? But it's still very plain. But you can see spaces, you see accents, and then we get to fancier, with the illustrated manuscripts of different kinds, okay? So the textual critic figures out what he thinks the original author said. Is the textual critic always right? Maybe not. Okay, probably not, but he gives it his best effort. And then once we have what we think is the closest we can get to the original, and by the way, sometimes they change their opinions over time. As other manuscript discoveries are made, even things like papyrus, like I told you about, little fragments of papyrus that are contracts or something, the more we learn about the way Greek words were used, that affects the decisions that a textual critic makes, whether or not a certain word would be used in that spot or a certain form of the word. So he creates a critical text. That's the Greek, what we would call the Greek original. And then from that we translate the biblical text. Okay? So let's talk really briefly about this. The Bible exists in about 2,000 different languages and dialects. That is the most translated book in the world. It's also the best-selling book in the history of the world. And as you know, the Septuagint was the first ever translation by anyone, and from any language from one to the other. And the Jews were the first people to have the idea of sacred scripture, of something that's inspired. Okay, so let's talk about the translations. Technically speaking, a translation is the language, refers to the language. The Bible in English translation, the Bible in French translation. We use the word translation to refer to the version, but the version really is how the words are rendered in that language. So when I say, I'm trying to think of something. Well, I'm going to give you some examples. There's lots of different ways to take a particular text, a Greek text, and render it into English. So the English Bible exists in many versions. That's why it'll say New International Version, Revised Study Version. It's still English, but it's a different way of expressing it in the English language. You can understand that, right? So the most famous English version is the King James Version, otherwise known as the Authorized Version. Well, who is King James and why did he care about the Bible? So James of Scotland, he was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. Remember her? And Elizabeth, Jeannie, they were cousins. And Elizabeth was the Queen of England, and she died without ever getting married, without ever leaving an heir, and her nearest relative was Mary's son James, who was King of Scotland. So when Elizabeth dies, James becomes not only King of Scotland, but King of England, because he's their nearest living relative. So this is when Scotland and England become the United Kingdom. Okay? And then you have the Union Jack. We all know what the British flag looks like. There was a cross like this, up and down, and that's the cross of St. George, who was the patron saint of England. Then there was this other cross in the shape of an X, and whose cross was that? St. Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland, so they put the two together. That's why the Union Jack is called the Union Jack. That's how you get the British flag. Okay? So why does he want to authorize a Bible? Because there were so many arguments in Europe over the translation of the Bible. The Protestants created sort of anti-Catholic translations, and the Catholics would do sort of anti-Protestant translations. In other words, they were skewed in favor of one side or the other. So King James didn't want that, so he commissioned great translators, great minds, to come up with a translation which would be balanced, it would be fair, it would be accurate, etc. So this is what we know today as the King James Bible. That happened in 1611. And this is the most famous English version because it was the one that was a standard English version for hundreds of years, until really the 1950s when we see some new versions coming out. This is the one with the these and the thous. This is the one you all memorized. You know, and this one we say the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That's the King James language. Okay? If we say, thou shalt not commit adultery, or the Lord is my shepherd, he leadeth me beside the still waters, he restoreth, that's King James language. We like it because it sounds very holy, right? Very pious, very reverent, but that's just how people spoke in 1611. The language of the Bible is the ordinary, common Greek of the day. There's nothing fancy about it. There's no, the idea behind the Bible was that anybody could read it and understand it, okay? But if you have trouble understanding the King James Bible, it's not your fault. It lets you off the hook. It's how people spoke 400 years ago. And we find it very difficult to understand because it's just so. I mean, people had different expressions. Okay? Suffer the little children to come unto me. What do you want? The children to suffer? No. Children can't suffer. It means allow, let, okay? So, when any writing is translated, the translator faces a kind of dilemma. He's got a decision to make. What is it he or she after? What are they trying to do? You have to decide whether you're really aiming for a more dynamic translation or a more literal translation. okay? And there are pluses and minuses, advantages and disadvantages to both, okay? So a literal translation is more accurate, but it's harder to understand. And you might say, well, of course we want the literal translation, but sometimes you read it and say, I don't understand what they're talking about. Because it references customs, colloquial expressions, and some of these things, if they're translated literally, thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy father. Hey, I don't want to see my father naked. I don't want to uncover his nakedness. It's nothing to do with covering or uncovering. Or Saul went in and Saul covered his feet. Saul went wee-wee. Okay? That's Saul peed. Okay? That's what it means. But what do you do with that? Are you going to say, the Bible says covered his feet. So I was listening to this guy, it was a very famous, my mother used to listen to this, J. Vernon McGee, Through the Bible Radio. And it sounds familiar to any of you? Remember that? So my mother would sometimes listen to this preacher. He says, well, Saul went in and he took a nap. He covered his feet. And I was like, oh, Mom, you know, that's not what he's doing. But they're not going to say he went to relieve himself in the cave. But that's my point. So you don't know what it's really telling you. Not that that matters, but there are times when it matters that we understand what was going on. So a literal translation is more accurate. So they're shooting there for accuracy. But you don't understand what it means. So that's kind of important too, don't you think? It's raining cats and dogs. So let's say I'm writing a novel, and my novel is wildly popular in Japan, and I have two characters in my novel, and they want to go out to go shopping, and it's raining. And so my web character says, it's raining we can't go outside, it's raining cats and dogs. So they want to sell my novel in Japan, so it has to be translated. So what does the translator do with that expression? It's a colloquial English expression. So, they might leave it. If in the story, the next character runs to the window and says, and Jane saw that it was raining very hard outside, they might leave it and translate it in Japanese, it's raining cats and dogs. And because the Japanese reader will be able to figure out what that means. But if they can't figure out from the context what raining cats and dogs means, then they might have to change it and remove it and say, we can't go shopping now, it's raining very hard. Do you see the point? So the translator has to figure out whether or not I should keep that statement, which does not make any sense in the new language, because that's a colloquial expression, or if I should keep it for accuracy. So they have to make that decision, and it's a balancing decision, okay? Because the Japanese don't have the expression. It's raining cats and dogs. So you want the reader to understand. Now the translator might say, I'm going to leave it in there, it's weird, but these are Americans talking, and they'll get a sense of the culture by this, okay? So what's gained if you keep it? You get a sense of the culture, cultural expressions, it's more accurate, but what's lost, you lose a certain amount of understanding, and you make it harder for the reader. There's always a balance. So, dynamic translations are easier to understand, but the translator decides what it means. Basically, because the more it's dynamic, the more you take it away from the literal, then the more the translator is interjecting his or her opinion, or they're influencing you, because they've chosen a word. There's a lot of Greek words that do not have a good English equivalent. Well, there's nothing we can do. We just do the best we can. But sometimes every word has a nuance, you know this. So sometimes you're giving a certain nuance by choosing to use a particular word. And cultural nuances are totally lost, okay? So, no translation is ever perfect. And no translator is exactly literal. Why can't it be literal? Because every language is different in what it allows you to do with the language. So there's certain things, I'm trying to think of the one that I thought of. Yeah, okay, in Hebrew, we know where Jesus says, well, what does He says to the rich young man, well, rich young man says, what must I do to be saved? And he says, or what is the greatest commandment? What's the greatest commandment? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and all your very. The ending is that, literally in Hebrew, you're very. You're very what? You can't do that in English. You have to have an object to the preposition. With your what? You can't just say, with your very what? That's why it says the very soul or the strength or something. So an English translator has to supply that word because it makes no sense. Okay, the same thing in English we might say, and they said, well, who said it? And somebody points and says that, and they mean that man. Well, in Greek, you can that or this is either masculine or feminine, and you can see if it means that man, it says aftos, okay, akinos. So you know that it's referring to a man, but it doesn't say that, so you have to supply that word. So if you have a Bible that has italics in it, that indicates that the translator has supplied a word that is not in the original. So in English, most of the time when we have italics, it means that you're using that for emphasis, right? But not in the Bible. In the Bible, it will say that in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos, everything was made through him, and not one thing was made that was made. Well, the word thing isn't there. It will say not one, everything was made, all was made by him, and not one was made that was made. That's not good English. So sometimes you just have to supply words. So no translation is 100% literal. And no translation is perfect, because you can never exactly capture the meaning of an original. It's just a fact of life. And there's a famous Italian saying, every translator is a traitor. Because on some level, they do betray the original, but we're doing it for us so that we can read it otherwise. But it's a kind of betrayal, so that's it. And I know the frustration because I did this for my PhD. I translated the oldest, or the first Greek patristic commentary on the book of Revelation. And I agonized over words. And I was never satisfied. And you just have to accept that it's never going to be perfect. It's going to be something. If I choose this word, maybe I should choose this word. And it's just agonizing. But that's what you do as a translator. The story of Jesus' very first miracle. Okay, so Mary is invited to a wedding. Jesus is allowed to come and bring a few disciples. And so we have the story of the wedding of Canon, which we all know. And this story has a very famous statement that's extremely difficult to translate. So what happens? Well, Mary learns that the hosts have run out of wine. So the Theotokos, she's very worried about her friends. These are her friends, and they've run out of wine, and it's too early because people aren't drunk yet. Okay? So there's nothing for them to drink. So I don't know how this happened. This must have been a big mistake. And so she says, they have no wine. We all have that icon, right? There's the icon of the wedding, where she's kind of whispering into his ear. He's sitting there at the table. They have no wine. So what does Jesus? He's not saying, "Here, Jesus, please go to the superstore and buy a few cases of wine for our friends." Do they sell wine at the superstore? I don't know. Because I know in some provinces you can only buy liquor wine at other places, special places. So she tells him this, and what does he say to her? Di ami que si yina. What to me and to you, woman? That's what he says. What to me and to you, woman? So this is why you cannot have a perfectly literal translation. Okay? To me, to you, woman. Well, what does he mean by that? What does he mean? So here's how that phrase appears in different versions of the English Bible. King James. Woman, what have I to do with thee? You know you're the King James when you see the thee. Is that more literal or more dynamic? It's really not literal if the original is what to you and to me, woman. It's more almost dynamic. But it's not even close to literal, but you can't render it literal. You can't what to you and to me, woman? New King James, this is your Orthodox Study Bible. Woman, what does your concern have to do with me? That's better English, but it's not any closer to the original, which is what to you and to me, woman. Revised Standard. Oh, woman, what have you to do with me? That's Revised Standard was the first really big revision of the King James Version. And that is a very, very good version, the Revised Standard, for the most part. Remembering the problems. Jerusalem Bible, a Catholic translation. Woman, why turn to me? They're even farther away from the literal. With this, New International Woman, NIV, dear woman, do you involve me? I love the dear woman. What about that dear woman part? Dear woman. So, involve is not there. Concern is not there. Why turn to me is not there. None of those words are there. So, when you have a friend that says, look, right here it says this, and they want to hit you over the head with a Bible, you don't even know whether or not the word is in the original. You don't even know. You have to look it up to find out. Why did the translator, NIV, some of you know NIV, it's very popular among Protestants, right? Probably the most popular version. There's also like a revised New International. Why do you think they added the word dear?
Sounds nice.
Yes. Because if you say woman, it sounds very harsh. And Jesus is speaking to his mother. And some Protestants came to the conclusion that Jesus had no respect for his mother because he addressed her as woman. So that's why the translators are very conscious of this. So they add the dear woman. So funny. Good news for modern man. Today's English version. What to you to me, woman? You must not tell me what to do. That's amazing. It's not a translation. That's a paraphrase. And you see, the more dynamic the translation, the more dynamic the version, the more the translator injects his own opinion or their opinion as to the meaning of the words. And that's a pretty harsh opinion. Forget about it. They're not even trying to translate what he said. They're translating what they thought Jesus meant. So everything in your Bible, every single thing, punctuation, headings, paragraph divisions, your footnotes is a decision of an editor, a translator. All of that affects how we read the Bible. It's hard not to, but even punctuation is a decision that somebody made. How much difference can it make? Well, there's a very famous place in the Gospel of John, I'll tell you what it is, where Jesus says, he who believes in me, as the scriptures said, out of him shall flow rivers of living water. Now, this little passage has caused some consternation among Bible scholars because nowhere in the Old Testament does it say, out of me shall come rivers of living water. So they said, well, what is this? Jesus doesn't really know the Bible. He's quoting the Bible, da-da-da. And Chrysostom had no problem with this because there's no punctuation in his Bible. But the way Chrysostom explains it, it's obvious that he's punctuating it differently. Jesus is not quoting the Bible. The person believes in Jesus as the scriptures have said you should believe in him. That person will, out of him will flow rivers of living water. It's not a quotation. But they assume that it's a quotation. Okay, so the punctuation can make a lot of difference. You could be saying Jesus doesn't really know the Bible because he's quoting something that isn't there. And that the same thing with that Gospel of Jesus' wife little fragment. It's funny, when they put it in the newspapers, they're saying, look, there's this fragment that says Jesus has a wife. And they put in quotations. Well, there are no quotations. Okay, so Jesus wouldn't have said, Jesus said, comma, my wife, in quotation marks. There's no punctuation, okay, at the time of Jesus. So how do you know that it doesn't say, feed the poor before, comma, Jesus said, period. My wife wants you to come to dinner, Jesus, said Peter. Do you see what I'm trying to say? Even if that fragment was real, there's no punctuation. So when the scholars published it, they put in punctuation to attribute those words to Jesus, the words, my wife. And you couldn't do that. You see what I'm trying to say? So a lot of the decision is made by someone and they have a bias. There's always a bias. We have to recognize it. We have biases too. There's always a bias. You have to be careful. How much is punctuation is? The Panda Eats Shoots and Leaves. This is a famous book written by an English scholar, an English teacher, because the panda, the giant panda, eats bamboo shoots and bamboo leaves. So we understand what that means. But the reason for the book is that the teacher once received a paper, and this is what this said, the student put, the panda eats, comma, shoots up the restaurant, and leaves the scene of the crime. It makes a difference. And that's just one little comma. So, in biblical studies, a lot depends upon what you think is a quote. And by the way, this alone is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. The decision to attribute certain quotes to certain people, the way Chrysostom decides what is a quote doesn't often always match our Bible. So the way the fathers of the church interpret something, especially quotation, remember, they're reading the Bible and there's no quotation marks there. So they have to figure out what words are attributable to Jesus, to Adam, to other people. And we just take it on face value because we're reading and the quotes are already there. It affects the way we read our text. I'm not telling you to be so intimidated by this that you're afraid to read your Bible. I just want you to be aware that these are real issues. So, here's another one. Another example. A woman without her man is nothing. Or you could say, a woman without her man is nothing. But this is, these are for your entertainment, but they're real. And the same thing can be said of punctuation in the Bible. So there is this is something else to be aware of. So as you can see, translating the Bible is a complicated process. There are a lot of things to consider, but I hope you will continue to read your Bible. Just be aware of these issues that are there before you come to church and say, Father Vincent, you're wrong because the Bible says this and that and the other thing. So you all come to Orthodoxy or you're Orthodox Christians because you know these things, but just be aware of this, and hopefully this will inform your understanding of the Bible, so when you're in discussions with people that you know, some of you have shared with me already, family members and others, you can use this to explain to them what manuscripts look like, that sometimes there are differences in translation, and this affects how we read the text. So we're we have some time before Vespers, so